The message appeared on my phone at 10:42 on an ordinary Thursday morning, the kind of morning that usually passed without consequence. I remember because I had just poured myself a second cup of coffee and was about to sit by the window, watching the quiet street outside my home. The sunlight was soft, almost golden, and my voice surprised me. It was calm.
Too calm.
Clara stepped in, her tone soft. Their house looked exactly the same as always, perfectly maintained, polished to reflect the image they wanted the world to see. Clara opened the door with exaggerated enthusiasm, her smile wide and rehearsed. "Elizabeth, I'm so glad you came," she said, hugging me a little too tightly, as if physical closeness could erase what had been said. I returned the gesture politely, but without warmth. Inside, everything was staged as usual: fresh flowers, spotless counters, the faint scent of something expensive lingering in the air. It all felt like a performance now, and for the first time, I could see the effort behind it. Daniel greeted me from the living room, his tone cautious.
"Mom, good to see you."
His eyes searched my face, trying to read something: anger, forgiveness, weakness. I gave him none of it. The children followed shortly after. Sophie, my granddaughter, hugged me quickly, her attention drifting almost immediately to the gift bag in my hand. Lucas, younger and more transparent, smiled brightly but kept glancing toward his parents as if waiting for approval. It didn't take long for me to understand. They had been prepared for this evening. Dinner began with small talk, the kind that fills silence without meaning anything. Clara led most of the conversation, skillfully steering topics away from anything uncomfortable and toward areas she knew would eventually circle back to money. It didn't take long. "The neighbors just renovated their backyard," she said casually while serving the salad. "It looks incredible. Outdoor kitchen, pool, everything." I told Daniel we should start thinking about upgrades too. Daniel nodded vaguely, but I caught the quick glance he shot in my direction, subtle but unmistakable. It was the same look I had missed so many times before, the silent calculation, the quiet expectation. "That sounds expensive," I said calmly, taking a sip of water. Clara laughed lightly. "Well, life is short. You have to enjoy it while you can." "Yes," I replied, holding her gaze just long enough. "That's exactly right." There was a brief pause, almost imperceptible, before Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom, actually, that reminds me, we should probably sit down sometime this week and go over your finances. Just to make sure everything's organized." There it was, not even halfway through dinner. I tilted my head slightly. Organized for what? He hesitated. "Just in general. Planning ahead. It's important." "For whom?" I asked. The question landed heavier than I expected. Clara jumped in quickly. "He's just looking out for you, Elizabeth. At this stage, it's important to have everything clear." At this stage. I let the words settle before responding.
I'm 68, Claire.
"Not incapable." Another silence followed, thicker this time. Even the children seemed to sense it, though they didn't fully understand. Lucas focused on his plate, while Sophie scrolled on her phone under the table, her attention already elsewhere. The rest of dinner unfolded in a pattern that now felt painfully obvious. Every topic circled back to something material: vacations, upgrades, investments, expenses. Every suggestion came wrapped in casual conversation, but carried an expectation beneath it. And every time I responded without offering anything, no agreement, no enthusiasm, no financial support, I could feel the subtle shift in the room. After dessert, Clara suggested we look at travel options for a family getaway. She brought out brochures, glossy and expensive, filled with images of luxury resorts and private beaches. "We thought maybe something like this for next summer," she said, placing one in front of me. It would be so special for everyone. And who would be paying for it? I asked. She smiled as if I had made a charming joke, but her eyes flickered. Later, as I prepared to leave, I paused near the kitchen when I heard their voices. They hadn't noticed me yet. I stepped away before they could see me, my chest tight, but my mind clearer than ever. By the time I reached my car, something inside me had settled into place. There was no confusion anymore. No doubt. Only certainty. Back home, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I sat in the quiet, letting the darkness surround me as I replayed the evening in my mind, not as a mother, but as an observer. Every word, every glance, every carefully placed comment. It all fit together now like pieces of a puzzle I had refused to see before. I walked into my study and opened the drawer where I kept my financial records. One by one, I pulled them out: documents, transfers, receipts. Years of support, quietly given without question. Loans never repaid. Gifts that had slowly turned into expectations. I ran my fingers over the pages, not with regret, but with understanding. Then I opened my laptop. The screen glowed softly in the dim room as I typed a single phrase: how to change a will. I stared at the results for a moment before leaning back in my chair. This wasn't about revenge. Not entirely. It was about control. The next morning, I made the call, not to the lawyer Daniel knew, to someone else. Someone who would see me, not as a mother, not as a source of money, but as a person with the right to decide her own future. When the appointment was confirmed, I felt something shift again. Not pain this time. Not even anger. Something steadier, stronger. For the first time since that message appeared on my phone, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was preparing. And this time, they wouldn't see it coming. The lawyer's office was nothing like I had imagined, and somehow that made me trust her more. There were no heavy wooden desks or intimidating shelves filled with leather-bound books, just wide windows, clean lines, and sunlight spilling across a simple workspace that felt open instead of oppressive. Her name was Victoria Hayes, and from the moment she shook my hand, I understood she was not the kind of person who wasted time on unnecessary sympathy or empty reassurances. She listened carefully as I explained everything, not interrupting, not judging, just absorbing each word with a calm attentiveness that made it easier for me to speak honestly than I expected. When I finished, there was a brief silence before she leaned back slightly and said, "So, you've realized your family sees your future as a timeline for their financial plans." There was no cruelty in her tone, only clarity, and I found myself nodding. "Yes," I said, "and I want that timeline to disappear." She didn't ask if I was sure. She didn't suggest waiting or reconciling or giving anyone the benefit of the doubt. Instead, she opened a folder and began outlining options, speaking in a way that made everything feel structured, possible, and most importantly, mine. "You have full authority over your assets," she explained. "You can redirect, restructure, or completely redefine how everything is distributed. The only question is, what do you actually want?" That question lingered longer than I expected. For years, my decisions had been framed around others. What Daniel needed, what Clara wanted, what would make life easier for the children. But now, sitting there in that quiet office, I realized I didn't have an answer ready. Not because I didn't care, but because I hadn't allowed myself to think that way in a very long time. "I want to live," I said finally, surprising even myself with how simple and true it sounded. "Not manage expectations. Not preserve something for people who are waiting for me to disappear. I want to actually live." Victoria nodded, as if that was the most reasonable answer in the world. "Then we build everything around that," she said. "Your estate should reflect your values, not their assumptions." We spend the next hour discussing structures, trusts, and conditions, But what stayed with me most wasn't the legal language. It was the realization that I still had time. Time not just to rearrange paperwork, but to redefine my life entirely. On my way home, I didn't go straight back. Instead, I turned down a street I hadn't visited in years, almost without thinking, until I found myself in front of the old community art center where I used to volunteer. The building looked slightly different, renovated, brighter, but something about it still felt familiar, like a version of myself I had quietly left behind. I sat in the car for a moment, unsure why I had come, then finally stepped out and walked inside. The air smelled faintly of paint and paper, and somewhere in the building, I could hear laughter. At the front desk, a woman greeted me with an easy smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. I hesitated, then answered honestly. "I used to teach photography here. A long time ago." Her face lit up immediately. "That's funny. We've been looking for someone to take over a beginner class. Our instructor moved away last month." It felt like something had aligned without effort, like a door opening exactly when I was ready to walk through it. Within minutes, we were talking schedules, availability, and ideas, and for the first time in years, I felt something that had nothing to do with responsibility or obligation.
Excitement.
Real, unexpected excitement. By the time I left, I had agreed to start teaching again the following week, and as I stepped back into the sunlight, I realized I was smiling, not out of politeness, not for anyone else, but because something inside me had woken up. At home, I went straight to the storage closet I hadn't opened in years. Inside, covered in dust, was my old camera equipment. I picked up my Nikon slowly, running my fingers over it as memories surfaced, not just of taking photos, but of seeing the world differently, of noticing light, detail, emotion, of capturing moments not because they were important to someone else, but because they meant something to me. I hadn't lost that part of myself. I had just set it aside. My phone buzzed on the table behind me, breaking the moment. "Daniel." I let it ring. Then a message followed. "Mom, we need to talk about Lucas's summer program. It's expensive, but it's a great opportunity." I stared at the screen for a second before setting the phone down again. The pattern was so clear now it almost felt predictable. Requests disguised as concern. Needs presented as necessities. Expectations framed as love. But something had changed. Not in them, in me. The next morning, I went to the bank and opened a new account. Not out of secrecy, but out of independence. I transferred a portion of my funds, enough to give me flexibility, enough to make decisions without explanation. I knew Daniel monitored things more closely than he admitted. I also knew he would notice.
And he did.
By afternoon, my phone rang again. "Mom," he said, trying to sound casual. "Did you make a large transfer today?" "Yes," I replied simply. There was a pause. "Why didn't you tell me?" I almost smiled. "Because I don't need to." Another pause, longer this time. "I'm just trying to help you manage things." "I've hired someone for that," I said. The silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was something closer to alarm. "You don't trust me?" he asked. "No," I answered, without hesitation. The honesty surprised both of us. That evening, I attended the social group the woman at the center had mentioned. It was nothing elaborate, just a group of people sitting around a table with coffee, talking about everything and nothing at the same time. But what struck me most was the absence of expectation. No one cared what I owned, what I could provide, or what I planned to leave behind. They were interested in who I was, not what I represented. I found myself laughing more than I had in months, maybe years, and when I returned home, the house didn't feel empty. It felt quiet in a different way, peaceful instead of lonely. Over the next few weeks, my life began to shift in ways I hadn't anticipated. Teaching photography became the highlight of my routine. My students were curious, engaged, and refreshingly honest. They asked questions not out of obligation, but out of genuine interest, and each class reminded me that I still had something to offer beyond financial support. I also started making changes at home, small at first, then more noticeable. I repainted the living room, replaced furniture I had kept only because someone else might want it one day, and slowly transformed the space into something that reflected who I was now, not who I had been expected to remain. Of course, Daniel and Clara noticed. Their concern grew more persistent, though it was clear what lay beneath it. Clara began visiting more often, her tone wrapped in politeness, but edged with tension. "We're just worried about you," she said one afternoon, looking around my newly rearranged living room. "You're making a lot of changes all at once." I met her gaze calmly. "Yes," I said. "I am." She hesitated, then added, "At this stage in life, stability is important." I almost laughed at how often that phrase appeared. "At this stage," I replied, "I'm finally deciding what stability means to me." After she left, I sat by the window again, the same place where everything had started, and realized how much had changed in such a short time. The pain from that message hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something else, something useful. It had forced me to see clearly, to act deliberately, to reclaim parts of myself I had forgotten existed. That evening, I called Victoria and confirmed that I was ready to finalize everything, not just the documents, but the life that would come with them. The day of the meeting arrived with a kind of stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I woke earlier than usual, not out of anxiety, but because my mind was already clear. There was nothing left to reconsider. Every doubt I might have had weeks ago had been replaced by something steadier, certainty. I took my time getting ready, choosing my clothes carefully, not for them, but for myself. I wore a tailored charcoal dress, simple but strong, and as I looked at my reflection, I didn't see the version of me they had grown used to, the accommodating mother, the quiet provider. I saw someone else. Someone who had finally drawn a line. Victoria's office felt different this time, not unfamiliar, but charged. When I walked in, they were already there. Daniel stood near the window, his posture tense, his jaw set in a way that told me he had been rehearsing arguments. Clara sat beside him, her expression controlled but brittle, like glass under pressure. My grandson, Lucas, looked bored, slouched in his chair, while Sophie sat upright, her eyes shifting between all of us, more aware than she let on. I noticed immediately that the room felt divided, not physically, but emotionally. And for once, I was not on their side of it. Victoria greeted me with a nod, professional and composed. "We're ready when you are," she said. I took my seat calmly, placing my bag beside me, my movements slow and deliberate. I could feel their eyes on me, searching for hesitation, for softness, for any sign that I might still be persuaded. They wouldn't find it. Before Victoria began, I spoke. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. "I think it's important that I say something first," I said, my voice steady but firm. The room quieted instantly. Daniel shifted slightly, as if preparing to interrupt, but I continued before he could. "For most of my life, I believed that taking care of this family meant giving you everything I had, my time, my energy, my money. I thought that was love. And maybe it was, at least from my side." I paused, letting the words settle. But somewhere along the way, that turned into expectation. And expectation turned into entitlement. Clara exhaled sharply, but didn't speak. Daniel's expression hardened. I didn't see it at first. I continued. Or maybe I chose not to. It's easier to believe in something comforting than to face something disappointing. But that message, I stopped briefly, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted them to remember it as clearly as I did. That message didn't create a problem. It revealed one. That's not fair, Daniel said suddenly, his voice tight. You're blowing this out of proportion. I turned my head slightly and looked at him. Am I? He hesitated, just for a second. Clara stepped in, her tone sharper now, the politeness slipping. We've apologized. Repeatedly. At some point, you have to let it go. I have let it go, I said calmly. That's exactly what I'm doing. Victoria stepped forward then, sensing the shift. Mrs. Carter has made legally binding changes to her estate plan, she said, her voice neutral but authoritative. I will now outline those changes. The room seemed to tighten as she began, every word landing with quiet precision. She explained the restructuring of my assets, the creation of new trusts, the redirection of funds. I watched their faces as she spoke, Daniel's controlled composure beginning to crack, Clara's disbelief turning into something closer to anger. Lucas finally sat up, paying attention now that the conversation had real consequences. Sophie remained still, but her eyes stayed on me. The majority of Mrs. Carter's estate, Victoria continued, will be allocated to charitable foundations, including educational programs, community initiatives, and senior support services. Clara's reaction was immediate. What? She said, the word sharp and incredulous. You can't be serious. I didn't respond.
I didn't need to.
Victoria continued, without pause. Additionally, Mrs. Carter will retain full control of her remaining assets during her lifetime for personal use, including travel, housing, and discretionary spending. Daniel leaned forward. So, what exactly are you saying? He asked, his voice strained. Victoria met his gaze evenly. I'm saying that your mother has chosen to prioritize her own life and values over assumed inheritance. Silence followed. Heavy. Unavoidable. And the children? Clara asked quickly, her tone shifting again, searching for something salvageable. What about them? Victoria nodded slightly. There are educational trusts established for both Sophie and Lucas. These funds will cover tuition and related academic expenses, contingent on performance and direct payment to institutions. Clara's expression tightened. And beyond that, she pressed. Any additional distributions, Victoria said, will depend on demonstrated independence and responsibility when they reach adulthood. Lucas frowned slightly, confused but intrigued. Sophie glanced at me, something like understanding in her expression. That's it, Clara said, her voice rising. That's all they get? That's what I've decided, I said finally. Clara stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is insane. You're punishing your own family. No, I replied, my voice still calm. I'm correcting a mistake. Daniel stood as well, his frustration no longer contained. Mom, this isn't you. You're letting emotions drive major decisions. I held his gaze. No, Daniel. For the first time, I'm not. He shook his head, pacing slightly. You're throwing everything away for what?
Pride.
For myself, I said. That stopped him. For a life that doesn't revolve around being managed, monitored, or expected to disappear on schedule, I continued. For the right to decide what my years mean, not just what they leave behind. Clara let out a bitter laugh. And what about us? We're just supposed to accept this. Yes, I said simply. The word hung in the air, heavier than anything else I had said. Victoria closed the folder in front of her, signaling the end. Unless there are legal questions, the documents are finalized. No one spoke. Clara grabbed her bag first, her movements sharp and angry. This isn't over, she said under her breath as she headed for the door. Daniel followed, though he hesitated for a moment, looking back at me as if searching for something, regret, maybe, or hesitation. He found neither. Lucas trailed after them, still processing. Only Sophie remained. She stood slowly and walked toward me, her expression thoughtful, not upset. "Grandma," she said quietly, "are you happier now?" The question caught me off guard, not because I didn't know the answer, but because no one else had asked it. "Yes," I said. "I am." She nodded, as if that confirmed something for her. "Then I think it makes sense." I felt something soften slightly at that. Not enough to undo anything, but enough to remind me that not everything had been lost. After she left, the room felt larger somehow, quieter. Victoria gave me a small, approving look. "You handled that well," she said. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle into something lighter. "It wasn't as hard as I thought it would be," I admitted. "No," she said. "It rarely is once you're certain." As I stepped outside, the air felt different, sharper, clearer. For the first time in a long time, there was no expectation waiting for me on the other side of the day. No role to fulfill, no obligation to meet, just space. And in that space, something new had taken root. Not anger, not revenge, freedom. 3 months later, I stood on a quiet terrace overlooking rolling hills washed in gold by the late afternoon sun, my camera resting lightly in my hands. The air in Tuscany carried a softness I had never known before, not just warmth, but space. Space to breathe, to think, to exist without expectation. Beside me, Margaret, who had gone from a professional acquaintance to a genuine friend, raised her glass of wine with a quiet smile. "You look different," she said. "Not just relaxed." "Sir." I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I adjusted the lens and captured the horizon as the light shifted, instinctively waiting for the perfect moment. When I finally lowered the camera, I realized she was right. Everything about me had changed, but not in the way people imagine when they talk about transformation. I hadn't become someone new. I had simply stopped being someone I was never meant to remain. The weeks after the meeting had not been easy. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no sudden understanding from Daniel or Clara. In fact, the opposite happened. Silence replaced their constant presence, but it wasn't peaceful silence. It was deliberate, calculated distance. Daniel called once, his voice stiff, asking if I had reconsidered. I hadn't. Clara never called at all. I heard through Sophie that tension had grown between them, not just because of me, but because without the expectation of future security, everything else in their lives had been exposed. Financial habits, unspoken resentments, the fragile structure of a relationship that had depended more on shared ambition than mutual respect. Eventually, they separated. When Sophie told me, she didn't sound surprised.
Neither was I.
And yet, despite all of that, I didn't feel the kind of victory I once thought I might. There was no satisfaction in their struggle, no sense of triumph. What I felt instead was distance, not coldness, but clarity. Their choices were their own, just as mine were now mine. For the first time, our lives were no longer entangled by expectation. Back home, my days had taken on a rhythm that felt entirely new, even though it was built from pieces of who I had always been. Teaching photography became more than just an activity, it became a connection. My students weren't just learning technique, they were learning to see. And in guiding them, I found myself seeing again too, not just through a lens, but through attention, patience, and curiosity. I began exhibiting some of my work in small local galleries, something I had never allowed myself to pursue seriously before. Not because I lacked ability, but because I had always placed my own passion second to everything else. My home transformed alongside me. The rooms no longer felt like preserved spaces waiting for future inheritance. They felt lived in, intentional, present. I changed what I wanted, kept what mattered, and let go of what didn't. There was no longer a mental list of things the family might want someday. That idea had disappeared entirely. The social group I had hesitated to join became another unexpected anchor in my life. We met regularly, sometimes for simple conversations, sometimes for outings that reminded me how much of the world I had ignored while focusing on others. Museums, gardens, small trips that had nothing to do with obligation. No one there asked about my finances. No one hinted at expectations. They asked about my thoughts, my opinions, my experiences. They listened, and more importantly, they shared. It was mutual, in a way my family relationships had quietly stopped being. Sophie, however, remained a thread that connected the past and present in a way that felt honest. She visited me without asking for anything, without performing. We talked, not just about school, but about choices, about independence, about what it means to build a life that belongs to you. One afternoon, as we sat in my newly painted living room, she looked around and said, "This place feels different now." I smiled slightly. "It is," I replied. She nodded thoughtfully. "It feels like you live here." That simple observation stayed with me longer than she probably realized. Not everything was easy. There were moments, quiet ones usually at night, when memories surfaced. Not just the painful ones, but the good ones too. Daniel as a child. Family holidays that had once felt genuine. The version of my life that I had believed in for so long. Letting go of that wasn't instant. It wasn't clean, but it was necessary. Because holding on to an illusion doesn't preserve it. It only delays the truth. Standing there in Tuscany, watching the light fade slowly across the landscape, I understood something that had taken me years to learn. My life had not been taken from me. I had given parts of it away, willingly, believing that was what love required. And while I didn't regret loving my family, I finally understood that love without boundaries becomes something else entirely. My phone buzzed softly in my bag. For a brief moment, I hesitated before checking it. Not out of fear, but out of habit. Old reflexes take time to fade. When I finally looked, I saw a message from Sophie. A photo of her at university, standing in front of a building with a proud, slightly awkward smile. "First week done," the message read. "I think I'm going to like it here." I smiled, typing back a simple reply. "I'm proud of you." And I meant it, not because of what she might become, but because of who she already was. Margaret stepped closer, following my gaze as I slipped my phone back into my bag. "Family?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "The part that matters." She nodded, not asking for more. We stood there for a while longer, watching as the last of the sunlight disappeared behind the hills. There was no urgency to leave, no schedule waiting for me, no expectation pulling me in another direction. Just the quiet understanding that this moment, this exact moment, belonged entirely to me. For years, I had been seen as something else. A role, a resource, a future event. But standing there, I wasn't any of those things. I was present. I was independent. I was alive. And perhaps the most unexpected realization of all, the one that made everything else fall into place, was that I no longer needed anyone to acknowledge that. Because I finally had.